Hello and welcome to the Lowy interview. I'm Michael Fullilove, the Executive Director of the Lowy Institute. Today I'm at the White House in Washington, D.C. for a conversation with President Biden's National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. You might hear some noise, some bangs from over here. That's laborers erecting a reviewing stand outside the White House for President Trump's inauguration on January the 20th. But Donald Trump isn't president yet. And during all the moments that have defined US foreign policy over the past 4 years, from Afghanistan to Ukraine, from meetings of the Quad to the formation of AUKUS, from October the 7th to the fall of Bashar al-Assad, Jake has been at President Biden's elbow. I first met Jake 25 years ago at Oxford University, and we've been friends since then. Today, he's agreed to speak with me about America's relations with the world during the Biden years, and what comes next. Think of it as an exit interview. Jake.
How are you?
Good. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Actually, you're having me, so...
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, thank you for hosting me.
Fair enough.
Jake, let's begin with the monumental events in Syria. Can you just reflect for a minute on the significance of the end of half a century of brutal rule of Syria by the Assad family, and what comes next for Syria? We've seen historically a number of dictatorships in the Arab world fall and resulting in disorder. So what comes next?
Well, as you say, this is a momentous event. And to the point you just made, half century of brutal repression by the Assad regime, first the father, then the son, and it's now come to an end. And why did this happen? Well, it happened for two reasons. First, because Bashar al-Assad refused to do anything other than keep his boot on the neck of his people. He didn't give them a brighter future. He didn't have an inclusive political process to lead to a kind of Syria that people could see themselves in. And second, Assad's backers, Iran, Russia, and Hezbollah, have all been weakened and distracted, so they were not there for him when he needed them. So he's gone. Now, what comes next? Well, there is both opportunity and risk. Huge opportunity for the Syrian people to seize their future, to work towards a democratic, inclusive government that serves the interests of all Syrians from all different faiths and ethnic backgrounds, and also a risk that extremists and terrorists will try to take advantage of this in ways that take Syria down a dark path. Our job is to help Syria maximize the opportunity and manage the risk. That's what we intend to do.
For the mullahs in Tehran, it's been a bad year, hasn't it? Hamas has been devastated, Hezbollah has been decimated, the Israelis have taken out assets, now they've lost their client regime in Damascus. Talk about Iran's predicament and what does Tehran do next?
Well, if you look at what Iran is facing now, it really is genuinely extraordinary. First, their main proxy, Hezbollah, has been defanged. Second, their ability to threaten Israel conventionally has been defeated twice. And not just by Israel, but actually by the direct defense of Israel by the United States of America with a regional coalition of countries. Third, Iran's main client state, Assad, has gone down. They've lost the number one client state that they have in the region. And of course, Hamas is weaker as well. And finally, their own military capabilities have been degraded badly by Israeli strikes against them in response to the strikes that Iran took against Israel. That is a very worrying picture if you are sitting in Tehran right now. And it's a picture that has been generated in part by direct Israeli action, in part by direct defensive action by the United States, in part by the deployments that we made from the very early phase of the conflict starting after October 7th. And it's all happened without the United States getting dragged into war. So from my perspective, the United States has backed our friends, our enemies in the region are weaker, and we have a genuine opportunity to work towards a better future in the Middle East, all without the United States ending up in a Middle Eastern war under President Biden.
Israel's strategic circumstances have been transformed this year, as you say. Does that create space to get back on track towards a two-state solution?
Well, first, the core proposition of the Biden administration from the moment President Biden came into office is that there is no long-term peace and stability in the Middle East without a two-state solution. We're just going to have cycles of violence if we do not generate it. Now, our notion, even before October 7th, was to work with regional countries, including Saudi Arabia, on a vision of integration and normalization that would be accompanied by a credible pathway to a Palestinian state that could live alongside the Jewish state of Israel in peace and security. Now, the politics in Israel have always been complicated on the question of the two-state solution. They have been made more complicated by the events of October 7th. But as long as we are sitting in this building until January 20th, we will push every day to try to create the conditions for a two-state solution to ultimately emerge. And part of the work that we're doing with other regional players, including Saudi Arabia, is all about helping to generate that outcome.
Just quickly, you mentioned normalization between Saudi and Israel. I know that's been a long ambition of yours. I guess it won't be done in the next month. Are you confident that will happen eventually?
Well, I have learned over the course of the past week and the course of the past year not to make confident predictions about just about anything in the Middle East because things are so dynamic. But do I believe it's profoundly in Israel's interest? Yes. Do I think it's profoundly in the interests of Saudi Arabia as well? Yes. The United States? Yes. The Palestinian people? Yes, because the Palestinians would be a part of that vision as we go forward. So we should be able to align all of the interests of all of the key players in the region, and also note that our adversaries really don't like it, which is a credit to the initiative, and say, let's do the needful, let's get this done on a bipartisan basis whenever it happens. And I will be there to support it because I believe that it's the right thing to do.
All right, let me take you to Europe. You know that in 1940, Franklin Roosevelt said that America would be the arsenal of democracy, assisting the opponents of aggression. Since February 2022, the United States and like-minded friends and allies have been the arsenal of democracy for Ukraine. Looking back at the course of US policy towards Ukraine, what are you most proud of and what regrets do you have?
Well, what I'm most proud of is the fundamental fact that before Russia rolled into Ukraine, all of the experts in all of the world gave Ukraine a week to live. Everyone predicted that Kyiv would fall, that Ukraine could be wiped off the map, and the Ukrainian people could be wiped out of the history books under the thumb of Vladimir Putin. Well, today, December of 2024, Kyiv stands, Ukraine stands as a proud and free country, and it will stand, and Russia's strategic objective in Ukraine has been defeated. And how has it been defeated? By the bravery of the Ukrainian forces on the front lines, the resilience of the Ukrainian people, and by an international coalition built and led by the United States of America and President Joe Biden that has provided them the tools that they have needed to withstand this onslaught from Russia. That is something to be not just proud of, but damn proud of. And I am damn proud of that. Now, at the same time, there is always a healthy debate about what is the exact nature of that support, how do we move a particular weapon system and so forth. I think people have gotten a little bit too focused on individual weapons as though they hold the key to the war. No individual weapon holds the key to the war. What holds the key to the war is the broad base of support, the massive historic undertaking to move heaven and earth to get weapons to the front lines and to ensure that the Ukrainians are armed with what they need to stand up to the Russian forces. That we have delivered on, and that was not a foregone conclusion. A different president sitting in the Oval Office would very readily have taken a different set of decisions, and Ukraine could be in a much worse place today, or Ukraine might not even exist today.
We discussed earlier that it's a difficult time for Tehran. It must be a bad time in Moscow too. I mean, Putin has sacrificed hundreds of thousands of lives in this brutal invasion of Ukraine, which was not just a crime, but it turns out a mistake. He's mortgaged Russia's economic future. He's just lost a key ally in the Middle East. This doesn't look like winning, does it?
It does not. And, you know, I sometimes hear people here in the United States or in Europe talk about Putin's strategic genius, about how Putin will figure it out, how he'll end up winning. And decision after decision and objective metric after objective metric shows that Russia is under pressure. It is incapable of achieving its strategic objectives in Ukraine. It has suffered enormous losses. It has mortgaged its economic future. It's lost its main ally in the Middle East. and maybe squeezed in terms of its presence in the Mediterranean. All of that has happened in the last 2.5 years because of decisions Vladimir Putin has taken. So Russia, like Iran, is in a weaker, more exposed state today than when Joe Biden took office. And this is the result of clear, decisive, effective policy from the US, backed by our allies, supporting Ukraine, and doing so with resolve and staying power. And I hope that that continues from the United States into the next administration.
I remember when we spoke early on in your tenure, you talked about imposter syndrome, and you said that initially you felt like when you first went in the situation room, there has to be another real situation room down the corridor where the real decisions are made. Obviously, you're a long way past being an imposter. You've been in the job for 4 years, which is longer, I think, than any of your predecessors since Steve Hadley. How has the job changed you? How has the job changed the president?
It's a great question. And if I'm being completely honest, it's made me, it's ground down my patience and my affability, because there's something.
What happened to Minnesota Nice?
It's still there, but it's been
Okay.
ground down. And the whole concept of leaving government, for me, the most attractive thing about it is I can build that back up.
Right.
I can get more patient, more affable than I have been. Because, I mean, honestly, between crisis, bureaucracy, and all the other challenges of government, government's hard, and it makes you harder as a person.
Yeah.
And you need to fight against that every day, and I've tried to do that, but it takes its toll.
What about the president? How has he changed?
I think one thing that's amazing about watching the president from when he was vice president to when he was president is the minute you're elected, you change, almost like physically, because you're carrying the weight of decisions in such a profoundly different way. And so I saw that instantly. And then over the course of a presidency, how you make decisions, your instincts, the speed with which you can kind of separate what matters from what doesn't, it's a learning curve that just kind of keeps going up. So I was with the president earlier today, going through a series of decisions, and it is a finely tuned mechanism, the presidential decision-making capability. And it's so much sharper now at the end than on day one when a president comes in.
We know your successor as National Security Advisor is going to be Congressman Waltz. Tell us a bit about how you've been managing the transition with him. What's going to be the biggest challenge for him, do you think? Is it going to be Ukraine? Is it going to be the Middle East? And which competitor is he going to spend most of his time in office dealing with, China or Russia?
Look, it's always hard to say, because when I came in, I don't think anyone predicted there'd be a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So we don't know what's going to happen. But I think that the competitor that is going to be of most consequence during his time in office is China, because it is the country that has both the desire and the inherent capacity to challenge the United States in all dimensions. And we have to be determined not to allow that to succeed. And he is going to have to attend to that. He has been a very good partner in this transition. We've spoken several times. I'm keeping him abreast of developments so that we have a smooth handoff, whether it's with respect to Ukraine or the Middle East or China. And he's been very professional and very open with me in return. This is how it should work. Two different parties, two different views on a number of critical issues, but a common belief that we have to look out for the American national interest. And if we can see that carry through, I think we'll be okay.
All right, let me come to Asia. Let me start with China, which your administration calls America's pacing threat. I'd like to ask you about the back channel that you've had with Wang, the Chinese foreign minister and state councillor. You have met a lot in Vienna, Malta, Bangkok, Washington, Beijing. Tell me about this challenge. What was achieved, including on Taiwan? What did you learn about China over the course of these discussions?
Well, our theory on approaching this generational challenge that the PRC poses, strategic challenge, is that we are in an intense and long-term competition with China, and we need to manage that competition responsibly so that it doesn't veer into conflict, so that we maintain lines of communication to avert crisis, and so that we create some space for us to work together on issues where our interests align. That has been the organizing principle of our approach to the relationship. What does that require? It requires a strategic channel empowered by the two presidents, President Biden and President Xi, of senior officials, myself and Wang, to talk through those strategic areas of profound difference and risk between the US and China. And that has included the boundary of economics and national security. It's included our differences over the South China Sea. It's included our differences over the war in Ukraine. And it's included careful, sober, detailed engagement on cross-strait relations to try to maintain peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. We don't talk about every issue under the sun. We focus on the areas where we have to be able to manage the relationship effectively. We don't agree on everything. In fact, we profoundly disagree on many things, but it has allowed for greater clarity of intention, greater transparency about what we are doing and what we are not doing. And it has also allowed us to manage through difficult situations at points when the relationship could have taken a very serious downward turn. Now, is the relationship between the US and China on a very positive track? It's a complicated relationship. It has some elements of cooperation, but deep and intense elements of competition that will endure. Managing that relationship, that competition, requires the kind of intense diplomacy that I engaged in with Wang Yi.
All right, in 2002, George W. Bush talked about an axis of evil between Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. That wasn't an axis, but we do see the beginnings, maybe, of an axis now. We see certainly a lot more cooperation between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. How concerned are you about that alignment, especially, for example, the deployment of thousands of North Korean troops to Europe? And also, there are fissures between those countries. What can the West do to try to expand those fissures?
It's a real concern, the alignment of competitors and adversaries in ways where they're supporting one another rhetorically and also supporting one another in very operational and practical ways, whether through economic intercourse or through the provision of weapons, or in the case of the North Koreans, the literal provision of soldiers to go fight against Ukrainians in the European theater. So this is a matter of concern. We've made no bones about that. I've actually developed and will soon sign out a national security memorandum that has helped orient our entire national security enterprise in the US government to deal with this reality. But let's be clear that all of these are not alike. Putin would like a new Cold War with the United States, and North Korea is happy to go all in with him. For Iran, its relationship with Russia and its relationship with North Korea and China, a bit more of a complex picture, and especially for China. China has a choice to make. Does it want to go all in with these guys, especially watching what's happening with respect to Russia and Iran just in the last few weeks? Or does it want to chart a different course? That's ultimately going to be up to Xi Jinping, a decision he makes. But if he decides to go fully down this road of adversarial alignment, it's not just going to be the relationship with the United States that's impacted. It will be his relations with Europe, with our Indo-Pacific democratic partners and allies, including Australia. And from my perspective, this would be a strategic mistake for China, but it's a choice that they're going to have to make.
All right, you mentioned the allies and like-minded countries in Asia, and this has, I think, been an impressive line of effort from the administration in terms of thickening links with India, Vietnam, the Philippines, bringing Japan and South Korea closer together, the Quad, the Squad, AUKUS. I want to hone in on AUKUS. What's the importance of AUKUS from the US perspective? The reason I ask that is there's a bit of concern in Australia about Mr. Trump's commitment to AUKUS. He hasn't said anything about AUKUS. We know he's a transactional person. He's not averse to renegotiating deals that have been done by his predecessors from time to time. If you were advising Mr. Trump, how would you pitch AUKUS to him? Why is AUKUS in the US interest?
Well, first of all, it is a generational commitment between allies to enhance our collective power on both sides. Australia having conventionally armed, nuclear-powered submarines enhances America's deterrent capability in the Indo-Pacific, and the United States providing this technology to Australia enhances Australia's ability to defend and deter itself. And then Australia is directly contributing to the US submarine industrial base so that we can build out this submarine capability, supply Australia in the nearer term with Virginia-class subs, and then over the longer term with the AUKUS submarines. So the United States is benefiting from burden sharing, exactly the kind of thing that Mr. Trump has talked a lot about, in which Australia is directly making this contribution. And then finally, it is a signal to the rest of the world that if you're a good friend of America, we will have your back, and that the good friends of America will have America's back. That, above all, that is what AUKUS says. And that is something that any American president, Democrat or Republican, should be able to get behind. And I do have confidence, in fact, that this will endure, because I think the incoming administration will see the merit in it.
All right, from the time of the Nixon administration, historians and commentators have tried to identify a foreign policy doctrine and associate it with a particular president. What's the Biden doctrine? I remember early on you talked a lot about a foreign policy for the middle classes. A scholar recently said that the Biden doctrine is leadership without hegemony. Let's see if that sticks. How would you boil down President Biden's approach to the world?
I would boil it down as simply as this. Have we invested in the sources of American power so that the United States, with allies and partners, can shape events, deter conflict, and defend the rules of the road that serve us all? So fundamentally, it is a doctrine of investment. Investment in the sources of our strength at home, our technological edge, our infrastructure, our defense industrial base, and the core engine of our economy. And I would submit to you that we will hand off an incredibly strong hand with respect to America's national strength, domestic strength, to the next team. Investment in alliances, so that our allies are more powerful, our alliances are bigger and more purposeful, and our allies are sharing the burden to a greater extent. Here, too, the picture is incredibly potent, from NATO to our Indo-Pacific alliances to the partnerships that we have with countries ranging from Saudi Arabia to India to Vietnam to the Philippines. And then third, investing in making sure that we are winning the race for the commanding heights of technology in the 21st century. Artificial intelligence, biotechnology, semiconductors, quantum. And here too, I think we are going to hand off a circumstance in which when we came in, a lot of people predicted China is going to be the dominant player in AI. And I think that that script is flipped. So that is the theory. It's about investing in sources of strength, and those investments pay off in our ability to drive towards better outcomes, not over years, but over decades. And I think we have made those investments.
And just on that last point, what would it mean if in the future the digital dimension, digital technology is dominated by an authoritarian superpower?
Well, I mean, for one thing, just from a pure values-based perspective, an authoritarian superpower having the keys to your digital future means more oppression and repression and more of them dictating for you rather than you having the freedom to decide for yourself. But it also means more military capacity to exercise hegemony over smaller or weaker states, or even over the entire world, if in fact it was China who got to the commanding heights of all these technologies and was able to apply them in the national security domain. So success with respect to high tech doesn't just matter for our economic future, it matters for our national security future, and that has been a central theme of mine as National Security Advisor.
In 2021, when you gave the Lowy lecture, we talked about a Churchill quote about allies getting more mixed up in each other's affairs for mutual advantage. Do you think that is that the future for Western countries, to get more mixed up in each other, whether it's technology or the defense industrial base?
Absolutely. I'll give you two examples. One is diverse and resilient supply chains. We are too dependent, even to this day, despite the work we've done to point us in a better direction, on China for things like critical mineral processing and other components that matter for strategic sectors of our economies, Australia's economy, America's economy. How we diversify and make more resilient our supply chains is all going to be about connection and mixing up of allies and partners, what Secretary Yellen calls friendshoring. Secondly, we, to your point about defense industrial base, we're going to have to co-produce more. Co-production with Japan on certain defense components, co-production between the US and Australia, which the steps we've taken on export controls to create a better rhythm between us will facilitate. Co-production within NATO for a integrated NATO defense industrial base. This is going to be an important part of having an arsenal for the free world going forward. There are other examples as well, but I think these are things we've set in motion in the last 4 years that will now have to play out over the coming years and decades.
All right, final question. You're a big sports fan. You're a Minnesota Timberwolves fan. I think you're a Man United fan in football.
Chelsea.
Chelsea, okay. In Aussie rules, you're a Sydney Swans fan. The last time I was in your office, I saw a Sydney Swans cap that I might have given you a few years ago on a display shelf. Yep. What is it you like about Aussie rules? Because most Americans don't understand it, don't get it, and don't like it.
Well, first, I like the speed of the game.
Yeah.
And I like the sheer athleticism that you need. It combines the athleticism and remarkable kind of physical capability of American football with the flow of a sport like soccer. It's not as stop-start as American football is. You put those two things together. Oh, and not as many concussions and brain injuries in Aussie rules football. I actually believe that if we got into it, the United States, it would take off huge, and also we would beat Australia.
Yeah, sure. Listen, you're a great friend of Australia. Not many people know this, but you and your wife Maggie, who's just been elected to Congress, have travelled a lot in Australia. You've been to the outback, you've flown over the Kimberleys, you've looked at the Bungles, you've been to the big cities. So, I wish you luck for the next month and for the future, and I certainly hope that there'll be more opportunities for you to come to Australia, whether it's to speak to the Lowy Institute, accompany Maggie on a Codell, accompany me to a Swans game. Any of those would be great.
Well, I would love to do that. One minor but important correction, we actually hiked in the Bungles, didn't just fly over them, because you can't do the Kimberley without being on the ground. And then there are so many places in Australia we haven't been that we have to get to. I mean, we do not have a better ally than Australia, and I care about it strategically, but I also care personally about my friendships and my relationships with the Australian people, and I really would like to get back down there soon.
Come and see us. Thanks for having us at the White House. Thanks for speaking with me.
Awesome. Thank you.